Awesome. Well, again, thank you all for joining us for the third session of the NIATx Virtual Change Leader Academy. You'll be spending some time with Matt and myself. Next slide, please. And just a reminder that this training is through a funding initiative, a grant funded by SAMHSA, and the views expressed here today are not necessarily those views of the Health and Human Services Office. We have four focus areas at the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence. So we work on integrating peers into different settings, building and strengthening the capacity of recovery community organizations, helping support and develop the peer recovery workforce, and then evidence-based practices, toolkits, and resources. And of course, always, we never want to describe somebody as their disease or their diagnosis. We want to always reference them as a person first. A little bit of housekeeping, if at all possible. I think you've all been with us in previous sessions, so you know this session is for you. The more you engage, the more we all get out of it. So we love hearing your feedback, questions, and comments. So if at all possible, if you can have your camera on, please do. Mute your line when you're not talking to avoid background noises. And then always feel free to use the chat to interact with Matt or myself.
And those are our intro slides. So I'm going to pull the slides off for a minute before we get started with our content for today and say hi to everybody. It's good to have you with us. And I wanted to start by just asking you all if you had any questions, comments, thoughts about some of the core ideas or tools that we've been talking about so far. If you've talked about or thought about the walkthrough idea, if you've had a chance to do something with that, very cool. We could talk about that. If you're thinking about doing something with that, you might have some questions or some need for a little bit of guidance in terms of what you're considering. If you've looked at flow charts or tried to draw a flow chart and it went well, let's talk about that. If it was confusing and challenging, we could touch base on that. Or if you have any thoughts about doing it. And also about the core ideas of teams that we've talked about in terms of change teams and those different roles of the executive sponsor, the change leader, the different team members. If there are any questions about that structure or that change team model. So just thought I'd check in on those three items and see if folks were thinking about them or had any questions or thoughts as you may be wanting to do some of those things. So what are people thinking, either about the walkthrough or flow charts or teams? And you also may be thinking, I haven't had a chance to think about any of these things. I don't know how I'm going to do those things, which is something that I'll respond to if somebody says it, because that's part of the process of figuring out how to do this stuff is like, where do I find time to do this thing? That might be the biggest challenge of all.
I know, Matt, when I did this process in Minnesota with a intensive outpatient treatment facility for substance use disorders, it was super important to have that executive sponsor support. And so some folks maybe were voluntold to join the change team. And in that, I shared this last week, but they did put a peer recovery specialist in charge because she had the most thorough understanding of where peer support might work in the organization. And then they invited me to just kind of be a mentor and guide for the process. And it kind of bolstered her authority in those situations, because again, peers tend to have the least authority on a clinical team. But it was very important to us that she hold that change leader role. And we had a mix of admissions, so intake folks, and then a couple clinicians, and then the peer on the team. And we actually did walkthroughs, had everyone do their own walkthrough and then whiteboarded it and just put it up and said, well, here's how it looks different depending on who did the walkthrough, which even was really valuable information for us, just to see the different experiences of folks. And from there, we were able to identify, at first, they just kind of saw peers as clinicians will make a reference, or a referral and say, oh, you should go meet with our peer. And then we identified about 8 areas within the organizations where we could more intentionally embed peer support, and really fleshed out, again, that idea of like peers weren't just there to work with people while they were like actively engaged with a clinician. And we put her on the front end for a while, and it increased the people who had reached out, the engagement from folks who had reached out, kind of done that first call for support and help with their own addiction. And then the peer would call them, then they would do intake, and they saw their numbers increase pretty significantly of folks who made that first call to folks who engaged with the process.
Chris, one of the things you were saying just made me think about a process that you can do with flow charting, which is to just draw the flow chart of, sort of the standard process. Okay, it looks like that. There it is. Those are the steps. And then say, okay, where peers? Are peers here? Are they here? Are they here? Are they here? And not only with the boxes, but in the transitional arrows in between. Okay, are they in step 1? Do they help between step 1 and step 2? Where can they be of an important resource between steps 2 and 3? What about, are they in 3? Just kind of walk your way through the entire flow chart and keep asking yourself that question. And that's a nice way. You just put on a lens. In this case, it's peer resource lens, and say, where are they? And we know where they are right now. And you could do it in two ways, or a 2-step, which is to say, where are they? Where could they be? Where should they be? The sort of a sequence, right? A sequence of questions you can ask yourselves as a nice way of exploring with your team. I like that one. So I know that Joanna gave a comment, said that's me when I said, I haven't had time to think about this. So I appreciate that. And one of the things that I encourage at this stage is, if folks say, well, it's hard to get rolling, I say, well, just have one person take 1 hour to do a walkthrough of something that is of interest to you. And of interest, by that I mean an area where you think you might have some challenges in customer service, where you might have some room for growth, where that there's kind of some squeakiness to the process, that it's not as smooth as you would like it to be. We all kind of know where those spots are to some degree, usually, like here's a spot where we kind of get hung up a lot, or we have some challenges here. Here's a spot that's important to the folks we're supporting, or here's where we get the most frustration from the people we're supporting. Here's where people, maybe they complain, but if they don't complain, you can tell that they're not thrilled with something that's happening, or something's a little stressful. Where do people tend to get anxious in the process, right? That's another way to think about it. So find a spot and then have one person take 1 hour to experience it from the perspective of the person who you're supporting, of that consumer of the service, and then bring that back to the team and let's talk about that. So that's one way to get it rolling that's not too challenging. And if you yourself can't do it, then think about how you're going to use team members and who on your team might be able to do that. So how does that sound? Any thoughts about that? Does that seem doable, manageable? I think with some of this stuff, it's just a matter of getting something to happen, because most of these things tend to build their own momentum, because once you look at it, if you use the tool, it'll create some awareness, and that awareness will drive some sense of urgency, right? Oh, well, we noticed something. We can't ignore that. That's kind of important. And then the system starts to move on that. The trick is to just do that first thing to kind of create that focus and that awareness, which creates that felt urgency among the participants.
And
So that,
something I think really specific to integrating peer supports, especially if they're new to an organization, is thinking about, this is where what we saw was the need for ongoing conversations about, to kind of break down the stigma peers face within a workplace. So we'd often, what we noticed was even talking about different areas where we could integrate peers to maybe streamline services or offer more support to the participants that we're serving, was some folks within the current system felt, I don't know if I'd say like threatened, or felt like it was a message that they weren't doing their job. And so they felt like maybe the peers were coming in as a, well, you can't do your full job, so we're going to bring in peers to kind of do it for you. So we had to create a way to consistently, and this is again where that executive sponsor comes in, to consistently say, this is, peers aren't coming in to replace you or to do your job, but they're here to further engage the people we serve in with person-centered support. But I would anticipate anybody in integrating peers is going to kind of get that sense. The closer we move to integration is when that stigma kind of pops up and people have questions. So you have to really intentionally build in a way to kind of tackle that. Like, how I would go in from the beginning and say, how are we going to help our staff with this transformation or transition, so that both the peers and the current staff have positive experiences with it.
yeah, for sure. Looks like we had a question or comment that Juan wanted to share.
Yes, I experienced that too. Like I used to pair new old one with new ones so they can be trained, and the old one felt like their job was in jeopardy, and I had to come in let them know that that's not the purpose. People move on, people get jobs, other opportunities in other places. So we can, if you leave, we have somebody else can take your position. And it was one of the biggest challenges that I faced when I started supervising peers.
Mm-hmm.
Peers feel track when you were bringing new peers, and they wasn't training the other peers properly because they was afraid, if I show everything, they're going to take my job.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Juan. I think sometimes I've seen a lot of peers maybe had past employment in other industries or other kinds of environments that may have had different standards, different practices, and they may have been in an environment where they saw that stuff happening, where there was some competition for opportunities depending on the way people were getting paid, or say if you were in, construction trades where you had to get jobs from whoever is the foreman of the job, and if you were working as a day laborer, for example, and they pick someone else instead of you, I mean, there's this kind of harsh competition there. So then they come into this environment where they're carrying some of those ideas, and then they might assume that it's a competitive situation, or that there is a risk to them. So I think that's always important to think about where people have been before, so they're making certain assumptions based on their experience. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So any other thoughts or comments before we transition into some other content? Okay, so I want we're going to talk about two main territories today. One is the nominal group technique, which is our brainstorming process, and the other is the PDSA, the rapid cycle change model. So we'll talk through the core elements of the model. So to start, we want to do the nominal group technique. And before I pull the slides up, I want to ask you all a question. And you can reply in chat or you can reply out loud. Tell me about a moment or a time when you had a brainstorming experience. Pretty much everybody's done some brainstorming of various kinds where people get together to try to come up with ideas, right? That you didn't like, that did not go well, that you found frustrating, stressful, that you didn't feel good about in some way. Just give me a reason why. Oh, I didn't like that brainstorming, and here's why I didn't like it. What's the reason why it didn't go well, or you didn't like the experience? So as I said, say it out loud or put it in the chat. I'm guessing most of us have had some negative brainstorming experience. I know I have had plenty of them. So who'd like to share something? Bad brainstorming. Why is it a problem? What was the challenge or the stressor or the issue for you?
So I used to have a contract for peers to pay the peers, right? And when the contract came to the end, ended for everybody. So now I have like about 14 or 15 paid peers that I had to give it the let them know they was no longer getting paid for what they was doing. You know, and when I met with them, you know, and break it down, you know, it's not like we did well, but the city ended everybody's contract, came to an end, was not refunded. You know, people got angry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why you cannot find money someplace else so we can continue getting paid? You know, and it was a frustration because, you know, I had to respect people's attitude.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was not like we just cut it. It was an ending contract and nobody got refunded.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it was difficult to deal with because some people were depending for that little money, you know, in their life. And now I'm coming in, well, this is what is going to happen. It was not something that was prepared, something that happens.
Yeah. So a couple of points. One, we'll want to make a distinction between an announcement or informing people of something like what Juan is describing that has stress and challenge in it, and the act of asking people for feedback or information, the more traditional brainstorming idea, where we're asking them so that we can elicit ideas from them. Juan's point is helpful to us when we think about trying to have dialogue with someone when they are under pressure. For example, if we said to those folks, you're no longer going to be paid for this work, now let's try to think about how you can, you know, what your next step can be. Let's come up with ideas. Let's do brainstorming. Well, it's hard to do brainstorming when everyone is under stress like that because they're very reactive. They probably will have a hard time being creative and thinking of ideas. So brainstorming sometimes doesn't work when you ask people for information, ask them for ideas when there's a lot of pressure or stress associated with it. So that's one challenge. What have other people experienced? Thank you for that one. What have other people experienced when you've tried to gather people together to get them, to ask them to share ideas, to problem solve, to do some brainstorming? What sometimes have been challenges or stressors that you've encountered?
So with me, the problem is I've experienced this, and Matt, you're aware of it, that when I try to talk to the therapist, being a peer support, and I have ideas, brainstorms, to introduce something new, they put up the roadblock. They know what they're doing. They went to school for it. Don't tell me how to do something new, even if it's a new way to, new thing to share with their clients. They say what I've been doing has always worked.
Yeah.
I don't need you to tell me something different. And that is still a big challenge here for me.
Yeah.
That they're not open at all to ideas that a peer has. I'm not saying all the therapists. It's, there's some that are open to a peer's information. And then there's some that just shut me down. That I know nothing. I didn't go to school for it. So that's hard when you try to brainstorm as a team, to brainstorm together. And I come up with ideas, they sit mute until I come up with the idea, and then then they got a lot of reasons why not to. But when asked something positive, they don't have it. But if somebody, like myself, speaks up, then they have comments.
Well, this is really valuable, Judy. Thank you. So I would say the broad category there is power differentials, people having more power than others. Now, if we asked folks, well, you're sort of making your position known because you have more power, and they might say, well, no, that's not what it is. And then we might say, well, if you have the capacity to accept or reject, to make a judgment and accept or reject the other people's ideas, and shift the process in some way, then that is power, right? To be able to do that. So then we have to think about what structures need to be in place so that every idea gets honored and certain ideas don't get judged or taken off of the list, or not allowed even to be on the list because some parties veto them, reject them, either as an individual or as a group. So the lack of structure in a brainstorm will allow some parties to control the flow of ideas and to make decisions without the whole group being a part of that decision, to say what will be a preferred action or a possible choice from the brainstorm. So that's a really important one. So thank you for sharing that. What about other people's experiences, challenges when you've gotten together with a group to try to come up with ideas to do brainstorming? Other things that have been difficult about that? Because these things often don't go well, or they don't go perfectly. There's usually some parts of them that are difficult. Maybe we could just get one more example of a stressor that someone has experienced when trying to do brainstorming. You guys must be having better brainstorms than me.
I found in some groups, Matt, that it'll be maybe 2 to 3 people over contributing, and then the others under contributing. So
Yeah.
I think that can often, it's both sides, we want people to speak up more, and we want those who have lots of ideas to take, back off a little bit, just to create space for those who need more time to ruminate.
For sure. Yeah. And sometimes that becomes so much the norm that we don't even notice it as a problem because, well, yeah, they're the loud people and yeah, they're the quiet people. And that's just kind of how our team is. I said, well, wait a minute. That means that the loud people are the ones whose ideas we're pursuing, and the quiet people, we don't ever pursue their ideas. So we're only getting half the strength of the team here when we're thinking about these decisions or trying to come up with strategies. So yeah, certain dominant parties, certain quiet parties. And it depends. Sometimes it's about how extroverted or introverted people are. Sometimes it's about how they process, as you're saying, Chris. People who process internally or quietly, people who process out loud and quickly. And those are the ones whose voices we tend to hear. So that's another good one. Joanna, you had something you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that makes it difficult when brainstorming is that not everybody has the same information. So if you've got somebody who is an administrator or an executive, um, they don't know, they often don't know what goes into a job or a process. And so they think it's acceptable to just bypass the process and bypass like the real obstacles that are there. And when you say this is an obstacle, they say something like, well, it isn't to anyone else. Well, that's because you're not actually doing the work.
Yeah.
So, like that's a big one, right? Because then there's no place to go from there, because again, that's a power dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a power dynamic. So in that case, there's a judgment of the idea where the party is saying, well, that's not really a problem, or that's workable. And you're saying, well, not from where I sit, it's not, unless something changes. There's a big boulder in the middle of the road and there's no room on either side to drive around it. So kind of stuck. And they're saying, well, just work your way through it. And you're thinking like, there's no way to drive through that thing. It's kind of right in the middle of the road. So what can I do? And so sometimes if someone has administrative power, they can tend toward a just make it so orientation, right? Just make it so, fix that thing. Sometimes folks with administrative positions are able to do that with a lot of their roles because they're able to say, assign someone to shift that. If you're saying, well, I don't have anyone to assign to do that, and I don't have the resources, so we have maybe a judgment or lack of appreciation of the idea. So when ideas are shared, if someone says, well, that's not really a problem, we have a quick snap judgment on it, which devalues the issue that's been presented by the individual. And if we couple that judgment with the power differential that you were just alluding to, Joanna, we have a double challenge, right? Two people with equal power, one can judge the other, and that's challenging, right? Because then other people might agree with the judgment and then the ideal disappears. But if a person has more power and they make the judgment, it's much more likely that the idea will be silenced and we won't keep it on the list, so to speak. So these are all really thoughtful reflections. I appreciate them. So what I want to do is to talk with you about nominal group technique, which is our brainstorming, our NIATx brainstorming model. And it's designed very intentionally and has been practiced, far and wide in terms of it being a really strong tool for creating inclusion, creating really strong participation among all the parties, dealing with a lot of these power differentials, dealing with the tendency for people to judge other folks' ideas when they're brainstorming. So I'm going to walk you through these steps. It's 4 simple steps. And if you use these 4 steps, I promise that your brainstorms will avoid some of the problems that we just described. And it's particularly powerful when you think about peer support, because several of you were talking about some of these power differentials. And peer services are pretty vulnerable to those because of the maybe lack of history within the system, the fact that certain parties don't understand the peer role or the peer contribution. Some folks don't honor that role or sort of think about these roles hierarchically, like there's the doctor role at the top of the list, and then there's the therapist role under that, and then the peer role under that. Well, I don't agree with that notion, but we see a lot of sort of people who think in terms of this hierarchy. And so we want to protect the peer voice and its power. And one way to do that is to use this technique, because it creates a balanced opportunity for all the participants in a brainstorm. So the key thing is it has to have structure. When a brainstorm is a free-for-all, then we're vulnerable to all the problems that you just talked about, right? When it's, hey, everybody, I've got a question. Give me some ideas. No structure, just say your ideas. I'll write them down. It's vulnerable to all those things that we were just talking about. So we want to create structures that protect the voices that are the most vulnerable to being quieted or to being not heard or diminished in the process, right? We're not creating these structures to protect the voices of the most powerful or the loudest, most powerful, they're going to be okay either way, right? We want to protect the quieter voices, the voices that might be more vulnerable. So that's, I think, very much in keeping with the peer value set. So, okay, so let's talk about this nominal group technique. It's a really useful strategy. So it's when you're trying to come up with a list of ideas. If you've done a walkthrough and come up with some concerns, you've done a flow chart to really start to look for areas where you really want to focus your energies on making a change. And then you're saying to yourself, what change can we do that will help us here? That's when you start to look to a nominal group technique. Let's ask a question. How can we make an improvement? What can we do here to try to solve this problem that we're confronting? So the way we prepare for it is that we come up with a good question. Lots of times you could do this when you're in a room together and just put the question at the top of the board. Sometimes you could do this remotely, like in a Zoom meeting like we're doing right now. You can do it live. You can also do it across time. I'll mention that toward the end after we talk about the sequence. It's important that you come up with a good question, and I like to think about the question in terms of its altitude, because questions that are too high up in the sky, how can we improve the program is my example here. That's awfully vague. I really don't even know what category we're talking about here. And then if they're too low on the other extreme, what can we do to improve the sign on our building? There's not a whole lot of possible options for that to answer that question. It's kind of a closed question, difference between open questions and open-ended and closed-ended questions. We want this question to be a very open-ended question, but we want to make sure it's not so vague in general that it's like, how do we fix the universe? Well, geez, that's too vague. It needs to be sort of in the middle. So part of the process needs to be thinking about questions that are focused, but that have a wide array of possible answers. That's kind of the two ways of thinking about it. So we come up with a good question and we share the question with everybody. So then the first thing that we do is we do a silent generation of ideas. And by that, I mean, we ask everyone to respond to the question and to write down their ideas. If you use Post-it notes, you could say, write one idea on each Post-it note. Or just take slips of paper or whatever works for you. A lot of people use Post-it notes for this process. It works pretty well. We want to keep each idea separate. So one idea per note or one idea per piece of paper, or make a list of ideas. I encourage people to try to keep them simple, keep them relatively short, because that will make it easier for others to understand them. And I said silent generation of ideas. And by that, we want to make sure that people don't talk. Usually people start talking when you ask them to start generating ideas. They almost always start talking to each other because that's what they're used to doing. Oh, hey, how about if we do this? What do you think it is? Is this a good idea? Is that a good idea? So what I'm saying is quiet. And if you're doing this, if you're facilitating this, you'll probably have to ask people to stay quiet because they usually don't. So let's say, okay, the reason we're doing this silently is because we want each person to have their own original, unique ideas and to not have those be influenced by others, because that will give us the full array of possible answers to this question from this group. If we start talking right now, all of a sudden, a bunch of our ideas will just get mushed into a few ideas. We want all of the wide array of diverse ideas. So just write your ideas down without saying anything. So give people a few minutes to do this and kind of encourage them to keep generating as many ideas as they can. So, and as I'm talking about this, feel free to interject and ask me questions as I'm talking you through this process. So that's what we do as that first step, is to get all the ideas on the table or on the list, so to speak. So after everyone has had a chance to write down their ideas, we move on to the second step, which is recording the ideas. We want to record all the ideas, and we like to use a process called round robin report out, which you've maybe heard of. Instead of getting all of the ideas from one person and then moving on to the next person, we like to just get one idea at a time from each person who's in the room, kind of go around the circle, so to speak, one idea, one idea, one idea, one idea. And that's by design, because that keeps us from kind of getting a dominant orientation. If we just start with one person, they'll sort of have a certain vision, and that kind of creates an orientation to the conversation for everybody else. I've often seen this happen where I know somebody had very different ideas, and somebody who has some influence, if you don't do a round robin, shares 5 ideas which set the course. And I can almost see the person crinkling up their ideas in their head while they're listening, like, oh, that's what we're talking about. I was thinking of something totally different, but I'm going to throw that away now because I don't want to look silly. That's what can happen there. So we just one idea, and then we get this nice array. It's this nice sort of tossed salad of a bunch of different things. So that's kind of the way you do it. And as you're having people report them out, we want to make sure that there's no discussion or judgment of these ideas. You know what happens with brainstorming when someone says, oh, I've got an idea. How about if we do X? And someone says, no, X won't work because, well, I guess it's okay, but I'm not sure. Or that's an awesome idea. Let's do it. All those are judgments, negative or positive judgments. We want to avoid all of that, because as soon as you start judging, you're going to influence people sharing. What's it like when someone gets a harsh judgment of their idea and then you're next and you have an idea that's in a similar category? Do you want to share it now because they just got shot down? Do I want to share my idea now? Probably less motivated, right? Might be, especially if I tend to be a quieter member of the team, or if I'm new, or if I don't really feel like I have a lot of influence. I want to be careful. So no judgments. We're just getting them out there, sharing them, right? No questions, no discussion, which also sometimes requires some facilitation. You have to remind people if they start to make comments. I appreciate your being supportive of your friends and your peers here, trying to share that you like their ideas, but we don't want to have any comments because we just want to let the ideas get out on the table just all by themselves with no reactions to them. We'll do that later. We'll be voting on them eventually. So we just go ahead and we do this round robin and we just get all of our ideas out one at a time, and we put them up on the board, or maybe you put them on a spreadsheet if you're using a screen, or some way of kind of just framing them up. One quick note is put a number on all the ideas. That usually really helps when you get them all out there. So after we've got all these ideas out on the list and we're kind of taking a look at them, then we are going to have some discussion of the ideas. So the best way to do a discussion is to read through every single idea one at a time, right? And have everybody hear them. It's helpful to have everybody hear the idea and to see if anybody has questions about them. Does everyone understand every idea? So for step 3, it's clarification. In order to make decisions and vote, you need to understand all the ideas. Think of all the times when you've been asked to vote on things and you didn't understand what they were, whether it's ideas for a brainstorm or candidates when you go to vote and you forgot that, oh, they're voting for whatever, and I didn't even check on those candidates and I don't even know who these people are. We can't vote on things that we don't understand. So this is the point where we go through the list, make sure everyone understands every idea. So we might then have situations where there are questions. I don't understand idea number 7. Okay, whoever created number 7, please explain 7 to us so that we can make sure that we all understand it. So clarifying the idea a little bit. This also can result in some merger of some ideas. You know, if a couple of your ideas are really identical, right? If they're very much the same, you might kind of merge some ideas together, but be careful about not overdoing that, because that can happen quite often where people start to merge everything into one idea. If they're distinct and separate, leave them as distinct and separate. So then after we do that, we then move on to the voting process. So in this case, in our list where we've got like 20 ideas or so, we want to give people a chance to vote. It's helpful if we kind of force a strong choice for folks. And by that, I mean, if we have 20 ideas, it's not helpful to give people 10 votes. I like to use a rule of about 10 or 15%. By that, I mean, if you have 20 ideas, let everybody have 2 or 3 votes, because that really pushes people to pick their top priority items, right? And when we ask them to vote, simple criteria of what's the best return on investment, what's the most effective idea, meaning how hard is it to do it, and will we get a good return on the investment in terms of implementing that idea? So that would be a good criteria for the best idea. So then you can think about simple structures for voting, like, do you use dots or something like that? You can also think about whether or not you want the voting to be private, right? Sometimes you can vote anonymously. I like that because then there's no pressure. There's no way that there's peer pressure in the room in terms of influence on other people's voting. So private voting can be good. You can do that just by having folks just write the number of the idea that they like, and then pass it, hand them in, and then count them up and put marks on the ideas to sort of figure out where we have votes. And that kind of will give you a sense of where the group is. So you can see in this case, we have a couple of ideas that tended to get more votes. And then it's helpful, I think, to then have a discussion about the ideas that got the most votes. Sometimes you can do multiple rounds of voting, right? Like get your finalists and then have another round where everybody kind of gets together to talk about those. Let me pause for a minute and see if we have any questions. Do people have any questions about anything we've been talking about so far with this? What are you thinking? Any questions? Just also want to just review a couple of these tips. Some of them I've already mentioned. We want to keep it silent when we're generating the ideas, to avoid that discussion during the round robin. Try to put numbers on them, neatly record the ideas. When we're doing the clarification, we're talking about understanding the idea, not judging the idea. So it's not about the quality, it's about, do I understand what you are describing here? It's not about whether or not I think it will work. It's just making sure I understand your idea. And then a good vote process where you have that nice clear choice, 10 or 15% of the items, and kind of give people that criteria for best, which is ease and impact. And so you see this little graphic at the bottom right. It's this 2x2 grid here. So things that get a star are things that are easy to do, that have a high impact. When people talk about low-hanging fruit, like there's the apple, it's right there, easy to pick, it's delicious, it's perfectly ripe. It's easy to do, and it's going to have a nice impact. So that would be something I would give a high vote to. You can also prioritize things that are difficult as long as they have a really high impact. And sometimes things that have a low impact you might want to do as long as they're easy, right? But we always want to avoid things that are difficult to do and have limited impact, right? Something that's really expensive that doesn't work is not anything that we want to do, right? So that's kind of a way of thinking about the ideas as you're looking at them. So that, let me just kind of go back up to here. Whoops, sorry. So this is a nice strategy for getting folks to a place of consensus as you're working with the group. I want to pause for a minute and see what people think about the idea of doing those steps. We're going to kind of come up with a good question. We're going to silently generate some ideas. We're going to sort of round robin report those out. We're going to then clarify the ideas so that everyone understands all of the ideas. And then we're going to do some voting so that people can select their priorities. This is a very structured, simple sequence of those 4 steps. Tell me what you think about it as you hear me say it. Just noticing a couple of our comments that people had when we were talking before, or maybe while I was talking too. Nicole saying brainstorming with our project director is amazing. She completely listens to us and values our opinions, right? So honors the voices of all the participants, and that's really critical. And Rhonda's saying the county, we don't get to brainstorm with staff that believe we don't have anything to share, right? So really that power differential or that judgment that can inhibit good brainstorming. So thank you for sharing that. That's a challenge. So in systems where there are those issues, it can be really helpful if you have an advocate who's a facilitator who is willing to support this, to try this, it can really open up some opportunity for voices to be heard. Johanna is saying that this seems highly useful structure that creates situations like Nicole's. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, this can help to create that listening. Yeah, if you keep people focused on these rules, then it will create listening for sure, because we're saying we're not doing kind of quick snap judgments. That's not what we're doing here. Let's listen and understand the idea. And then we will do judgments at the end, which is to vote, right? But we're waiting. We're not doing that right on the front end. We're going to be thoughtful about these ideas. Silent brainstorming. Chris likes that idea. Force you to think critically, generally do not speak up because I fear judgment. Yeah, and that's so common. One of the things we notice in human services is that we think that we have trusting environments, sometimes more than we do. We think that we have safety in our environments for sharing, sometimes more than we do. We're vulnerable to overrating those environments in terms of their felt safety, because the core values of the field are about trust and sharing, right? So we just think, well, everything we do is filled with trust and sharing because that's what we value. So sometimes it's hard for a system to say, you know what, that process really doesn't reflect the kind of trust and sharing that we say is our value. If we use this nominal group technique, then we're more likely to be living that value, because it does create a safer environment for everyone. Any other thoughts or comments? What do you think about using it, about trying it? Sometimes people will say to me, well, it seems like it would be hard to control folks, kind of like manage people when they want to share or when they want to make judgments or comments about ideas. It seems like there's quite a bit of control of the process that would be required as the facilitator, which is true to a degree, depending on how compliant the group is with the rules. You kind of know your groups. Some groups are easier than others to shift toward this process. How effective would this process work with such a small staff? Chris, can you say out loud, can you unmute and say out loud in terms of what you're thinking about as a question related to the size of the group?
Yeah, like if you're only brainstorming with 1 or 2 or 3 people, like I just wonder if it, like, I mean, I guess the process would still work. The silent, like the whole thing.
That's a good question. That's a good question. It is a little less effective with a really small group, like 2 or 3. It's kind of built for the neighborhood of 6 to 12, you know, kind of in that neighborhood. But that said, I've seen it work for small groups. It's probably not so useful with a dyad, right? But 3 or 4, you could use this. But you get a little bit more kind of intensity of people's expressions and opinions, and it's sort of clear, like one person thinks this and another person thinks that, and that becomes kind of clear when it's, especially if 2 people have different ideas, you know, sort of different visions, that makes that a little harder. So if you can do it with more people, if there's a way to get 4 or 5 at least, I would recommend that, to try to get the volume up a little, because then you have more diversity of ideas and you get more volume too. Because if you just end up with a list with 5 or 6 things on it, that puts a lot of pressure on the ideas. You know, it's better to have a bigger list, right? If we have 30 or 40 ideas, then that's nice, because then we can really think about, and we can learn as we're looking at all these different ideas, and we will maybe change our perceptions. If you just have the same old 5 ideas, well, of course, that's what he said. He always says that, and there's only 3 people at the table. And we sort of just, it's basically people stating their opinions that we already know, rather than a brainstorm where we get a bunch of ideas. So diversity and volume of participants is really helpful, and having people with different experiences is really helpful, right? We don't want a group of people who are all doing the same thing, like who all have the same role. because they'll tend to probably have share similarities in vision. It's nice if we have people with different roles, different jobs, different perspectives, different lived experience. That will help a lot to get diversity of ideas. Thanks for that. Anybody else have questions or thoughts or concerns about how this would work? All right, so I want to encourage you to try it. Just try those 4 simple rules. Next time you have a question and you have a team of people, and if you're feeling like you might not have the pull with the system to facilitate this, get a partner, get with someone else who does maybe facilitate, the meeting. Like if you have a supervisor who facilitates a meeting, get with them and say, hey, I'd like to try this experiment. Can I do it with you? Can you help me to do this? Can you support the process so that we can get folks to try this experiment as a way of asking a question and generating ideas? So most of the time, if you're kind of gentle but firm with the rules, people will see that it's productive. I will tell you though, sometimes people get a little grumpy about it because they don't maybe like to be controlled because they're used to just saying stuff however they want to. And so sometimes people get a little reactive, but then I think it's important to just go back to the value. Why are we doing it this way? Because we value inclusion, because we value diversity of thinking, because we value the quieter voices that aren't always heard. And not too many people are going to say that they don't value those things, you know. Well, I don't care about the quiet voices. I just like to hear my voice because I'm the loudest. So let's go back to the old way. Even though someone might think that, they're not going to say it. So if you can just kind of restate the values, it's not likely you'll be at a table where someone will oppose those values. And it's pretty hard to argue against this process because it's clearly going to create more of a fair opportunity for sharing among all the parties at the table. So that's
And I
usually
would say too, Matt, to not wait for a super high stakes decision.
Yeah, good point.
To do it just like if this model, if you want to test it out, I would start on super simple, easy. Even if you made one up, like, what color should we paint this wall, and get people used to the process. And that way, when you come to the high stakes situation, you're not having to adjust to like, well, this is new and it's uncomfortable.
Yeah.
That's all out of the way. They understand the process and the purpose and how it flows. And so when it's high stakes, it'll go a little bit more smoothly.
Yes, I agree. It's like if you take a first aid course and you're walking out the door right after having taken your first aid course and someone says, help. It's like, that's not I just practiced it once. I don't want to have to do it right now. I'm not at my best. Let me go to the rest of the classes and practice it 5 times before I have to do this rescue thing. Yeah, because when there's pressure and stress, that's not the time to be trying a new tool, right? That's the time where we want to use something that's tried and true that we're comfortable with. So Chris, I think your point is an excellent one. Practice this, right? I encourage people to just do it over and over. Each time you have an issue that you need to discuss with your team, do one, right? Do this 4-step sequence and try to generate ideas. And if you do it repeatedly, as I think your point is spot on, Chris, then you'll be prepped for when you have one of those high stakes issues where there's some stress and pressure. So, and people will be acclimated and they'll be skilled with the tool and they'll be comfortable. So yeah, it does take some practice to get used to it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So you have your team and you're going to discuss on how to paint the wall or what color to paint the wall. Something small, like you said. What happens with the negative Nancy's that say, I wasn't on the team, I wasn't picked for the team. Right. I hear, you haven't even made the decision to do it yet, but they heard from the other people that they might be doing this. And how come they didn't ask me?
Sure.
How do you deal with all that
Yeah, that's that,
negativeness, because that's what we have. We have
right.
a lot that, you know, you made a decision, or this group made a decision, and this team made a decision. They didn't even ask the people that it's going to affect.
Mhm,
Um, how do you deal with that?
That's
Put
a
them on
great
the team?
question. Right, that's a great question, Judy. It speaks to the development of the team on the front end. So if we have some supervisory or executive sponsorship where the team is rolled out, where there's a clear message that we're developing a team that is going to do some work to try to help us with some improvements. We're going to make that a representative team. It won't include everyone. It will include representatives from different roles. So we'll try to represent each kind of role or different voices, a diverse group. And this group does not have sort of executive power to, to decide policies and procedures for our organization. They're trying to explore some ideas for us. And so they're going to do some of that work. So let's say the team does this work and then they generate some ideas. Now, this is where the leadership can be really helpful. So if you know that you have some of that factionalism within the system, like there's a group of people who think this and a group of people who think that, try to get representation on that team that represents those two factions, or 3 or 4, depending on what your system looks like. Try to represent a team that has the diversity of opinion, which sometimes doesn't happen because people will say, well, we're only going to invite people to the team who are kind of interested in this particular change area, who want to do this new thing. That can be a mistake. It's a good idea to invite people who are really kind of forward thinking and excited about change, but also someone who might be a little bit hesitant. Now, we don't want to have people forced to be on a change team if they don't want to be, but sometimes someone might be a little more conservative about a change, and that's fine. We want them in the mix because they might have some good ideas like, hey, be careful, don't do that thing because you might get into trouble with this thing. Whereas other people who are really forward leaning will say, well, let's just go. I don't care. Let's do it. That balance is helpful. So setting up the team to have representation can prevent some of what you just described, Judy, in terms of people later saying, hey, my idea wasn't even in the mix, or you didn't ask me. Well, someone who maybe represents some of your thinking was in the mix. The other thing you can do is that the process that is completed by the team does not, as I said, represent a new policy. Then leadership needs to take the ideas and then share them with the broader group and say, we came up with this array of ideas. If there is a lot of tension, then leadership can be cautious about that and can say, the group generated five options. And now as a broader system, we're going to entertain these 5 options and do some work with these, exploring how people feel about these 5 options. So if you might need to be cautious rather than saying the group said, we're gonna try this new principle. This is in part a good segue into talking about PDSA change, because one of the things that we often say with PDSA change is, don't get too uptight if we chose a certain change project and you're not thrilled with it. We're doing rapid cycle change and we're going to try something quickly. If it doesn't work, we'll move on to something else. So it's not like we've changed something and we're going to leave it in place forever, even if it doesn't work. So that can take some of that pressure off too, if people feel like their idea was not supported or their vision was not chosen as a direction or as a project. So those are a couple of ideas that I think could help with what you're describing, Judy. Okay. So that is, I think, a good segue for us to talk about PDSA change. So I'm going to now move us into that territory. We got about a half an hour, so we're in pretty good shape. So we want to talk about PDSA change models. So, oops, hold on one second. Okay. All right, so some of you may be familiar with this idea. PDSA, sort of the heartbeat of this model. So we do a walkthrough, we do a flow chart of what we learned, what we experienced in our walkthrough. We generate some areas where we think we could make changes. We do a nominal group technique and we come up with an idea that we want to do, a change project idea. So now we're going to use the PDSA model to implement that change project. So the PDSA stands for Plan, Do, Study, Act. So if you think about this from starting at 12 o'clock on this circle and working your way clockwise, first we plan out a project, then we do it, we implement it, kind of make observations as we're going. Then we study our results, and then we decide to take action. And we have 3 possible actions. We can abandon it if it didn't work. We can adapt it if it needs to be adjusted a little because it kind of worked, but not perfectly. So we might want to adjust it, or we can adopt it because it worked wonderfully and we're just going to keep doing it, right? So that's the kind of core idea here. These are simple experiments. Think about simple scientific experiments where we're going to test something, a pilot test of something to see if it works. And depending on the results, we'll then take our next steps. And sometimes the results lead us to do what we call multiple cycle tests, multiple PDSA cycles. So we'll do 1 cycle of an experiment and it works. And then we'll say, well, it kind of worked, but we think we can adjust it a little bit. And then we'll do another PDSA. Oh, that helped a little more. Then we'll do another PDSA. Each time adjusting it a little bit. Think of it like a scientific experiment in a lab where you say, well, what happens if we add this chemical? Oh, okay. That kind of worked. Well, what happens if we add that chemical? Oh, something different. Okay, we're still moving forward. We're progressing toward our goal. So this is the idea of how we use these PDSA cycles. And we like to think of these as rapid cycles. So we don't like for the PDSA to take months and months. We like to think instead in terms of days and weeks. So if there's something we can do in 4 or 5 weeks as an experiment to see if it works, that's great. And this is all focused on the data, as you saw when we said PDSA, there's the S, which is the study part, right? So we're planning it, we're doing it, then we're studying our results. What did we learn? So we have to have some good data in the mix, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means in terms of the data process. And we do have the form that's part of the resources for you. We have our change project form, which includes all the sort of information that you need on the form to fill in to be able to create this change project and to document it. And it has a spot on page 2 of the form to document this plan, do, study, act part of the process. Actually going to skip here for a minute. I'm gonna sort of show you a picture here. I use this sort of example for if you wanted to spin a quarter and see how long you could spin it for, and we wanted to do this as a rapid cycle change model. Sometimes I like to play around with these little tops. So here's one. See, look, I'll show it to you. See, look. See, spinning. Can you see it? Yeah, you can see it. All right. So how many seconds is it going to spin for? 7, 8, 9, 10. Oh, looks like it's going to spin for 12, 13. 14. All right, so it's almost done. Okay, there it stopped. So as a silly little example, I could do a rapid cycle test on that top. I could say, first I need a baseline. How are we doing right now in terms of our current state? Like, how good are we doing at keeping our clients engaged in services? How many people are we keeping for the first 4 weeks? How many seconds does the top spin right now? So we record our baseline. What's our current state? Then we come up with some sort of a knowledge of that based on some clear measurement. And then we set a goal. It's good to have a goal for these PDSA cycles. We want to get it up. We want to double the number, increase it pretty dramatically. So then we have to do a PDSA. So we're going to do a cycle. We're going to do the PDSA cycle. And let's say we made an improvement. We came up with something that we thought would create a better improvement on that spinning of that top or that quarter. And we changed our strategy and it increased it pretty significantly. Now, this is where we get to that, do we do another cycle or do we just leave it where it is? Well, we said we wanted to get it up to 9 and we got it up to 6.5. So I think we're going to do it again. We're going to change it, do something else. And that raised it a little bit. So maybe we'll try something else, a third thing. And then it keeps going up a little bit. Well, maybe we'll try it a fourth thing. Okay, so we're almost there now. So if we look at the trend here, we're doing pretty good, right? If we recorded this on that form, we'd be kind of doing those cycle tests, and we would be recording what's happening with each PDSA on the form. So the change form, as I said, has 2 pages that are really relevant to recording this. Now, the first page looks like this, which is how we record the nuts and bolts of this change project that we're going to do. I'm going to talk with you for a minute about that aim statement idea that you see in number 2. So I'll come back to that in just a minute. But we might have a certain location in our program, number 3. What are our start and our end dates, right? What are we, who's involved in this? Who are the customers? Remember, back to our roles: who's the executive sponsor, who's the change leader, who are the members of the change team? How are we going to collect data on this? And what's the expected impact? How are we going to know, again, back to our principles, what keeps the CEO awake at night? So see how our principles are embedded in here as well. And then we plug it into the form. And this is how we record the plan, the do, the study, what did we find out? And then what are we going to do? Are we going to adopt this, adapt it, or abandon this based upon what we've learned? There's also a third part of the form, which is allows you to talk about the outcomes, what happened, and then sustainability. If the change went really well, then we would want to sustain it and have a nice sustainability plan for continuing to do it because it was successful for us. So I'm going to come back to our PDSA slide for a minute. So let's kind of just come back to this again. So I want you to think about something in your experience, something that let's say you did a walkthrough, and then you did a flow chart, and then you did a nominal group technique, and you came up with an idea. Does anyone have something right now that you're thinking, I think we should do this. I think we should make this improvement. Does anyone have an improvement that you're thinking about doing to your services that will make a difference, that will enhance them in some way? Is there something that you've just done lately that's an improvement? Are there changes that are in the works for you? So it'd be cool if anybody had an example of something that is in the works for you right now.
Yes. I'm planning to start going to the jail here in town, visit some of the folks that are substance dependency, and I want to use a teaching thing from ACEs and do an ACEs training, just like an hour a day, and so I'm working that out with the sheriff and the lady that keeps the jail right now. And we've donated some books that are What Happened to You, that were put out by Oprah Winfrey and some doctor. And so the follow-up for me is to go in there and go over the ACEs training with them.
Okay.
That's something new.
Yeah. So are you currently, Dwayne, are you currently going into the jail already?
I was until COVID, and now they're going to
Okay.
start letting us back in again. I mean, It's been a year and a half probably, but I have corresponded with the sheriff and the lady that runs the jail. So
Okay. So let's think about this together as a potential PDSA. So if we had, let's make an assumption just for the sake of our description of this. If we have, sorry. Let's assume that you've been going in, let's assume COVID hasn't sort of derailed some things, right? You've been going into the jail regularly. Now you're going to, the change that you want to implement is to go into the jail and add the ACEs tool to the process. Let's say you go in once a week and you do a group process, and now you're going to go in and you're going to include the ACEs tool. Tell me what you think can happen if you use the ACEs tool that would be different than what's happening now. What do you think it will achieve? Will there be a result from this? What are you hoping will happen if you do this?
I hope that there'll be an understanding of what ACEs is all about, and that, number one, that they can have discussion among themselves while they're still there. And number two, to do follow-up and meetings with them based on that.
Yeah.
I think it's a core part of what's going on.
Yeah. And do people who you serve in the jail, are they generally open to having individual meetings with you, or?
Well, that's the thing. They weren't letting us have group meetings, and then they were just individual. So I
Okay,
would rather do it in a group setting, but if need be, I'll just do one at a time.
okay. So when we're talking about how to measure, here's an example of a potential measure to find out if this thing is working or not. Let's say, oh, maybe half the people are open to having individual meetings with you, and under the current model. And you're thinking you have a hypothesis, right? Which is from your plan. That's your prediction. Let me put the picture back up so we can look at it together while we're talking this through. So we think about our plan, right? So if Dwayne's thinking that if we can do the ACEs tool, we'll get more engagement of people. And the way we'll measure engagement is that more people will want to talk to us individually than currently do. We offer it to everyone who we interact with, but let's say only half of them want to talk to us. We think that the ACEs tool will be a way to engage them, that it'll help them to connect some of the dots in terms of their own experiences, and to help them maybe feel more comfortable in reaching out to us and sharing with us and talking to us. So we could first measure our baseline, right? When we show the graph I showed you, how are we saying it's 50%, right? 50% of people, there we are, there's our baseline. 50% of the people in the group are currently open to individual meetings. Of course, Dwayne, this is not exactly what you're doing, but I'm just using it, I'm adjusting it a little bit just for the sake of our conversation to make it an easy example for us. And so we're saying, well, we're going to try to get this up to 100% of people who are participating being willing to talk with us. It's at 50% now. So what we're going to do for our first cycle is we're going to introduce this tool, right? This tool, which is this ACEs tool. And we found that when we introduced the ACEs tool, we went up to 75% of folks who are willing to do individual conversations with us. So we did the ACEs tool for 3 or 4 weeks, and the number of individual conversations went up to 75%. It increased quite a bit. It didn't get all the way to our goal, of course, but it increased quite a bit. So then, Dwayne, you and your team might then, after you're now at this PDSA process where you did the PDSA there, we studied our first cycle and we said, oh, we got to 75%. So let's study that and think about that. Now, what do we want to do? Do we say, okay, we're done, we're good, let's keep doing the ACEs tool, right? Are we saying we don't like it, we're going to quit it? Well, we had quite a good improvement, so I don't think we would quit it, right? We're not going to abandon it. So the question is, do we adapt it? Do we adjust it to try to get it to go higher? Or do we say we're good? In this case, Dwayne, what do you think you would do? Would you say we're good, or would we try to adjust it some more? What's your knee-jerk reaction?
Well, we all want 100%, so
right?
I think there's room for adjustment.
Okay, so you might say we got partially to our goal. Let's see if we can do a second cycle. So here we're going to do a second cycle. So in addition to the ACEs tool, which got us halfway to our goal, we're going to add another element on. Notice we didn't do both those things at the same time, because if we did, we wouldn't know if it was the ACEs tool or this other thing that really had the influence. One step at a time so we can measure each thing. The ACEs tool worked pretty well. So now we're going to add on a second intervention, a second tool, a second process, a second something. Maybe we need to do some nominal group technique brainstorming to figure out what that could be, right? We could use that other tool to say, here's a bunch of ideas. I don't know if you have anything in mind, Dwayne. Do you have any thoughts, or is there anything sort of on the list for you?
No, this is really going to be new to get started, and I don't have another bump up. And when you talk about discussing it with like my peer workers, I'm the only one.
Okay. All
I
right.
work for Southwest Cap and I'm affiliated with HHS, but I'm on my own pretty
Gotcha.
much. So
Gotcha.
these are things I wanted to implement. And
Sure. In that case, if you wanted to have a team conversation, you need to engage other folks. Like you might have someone from the jail participate in a conversation with you. You might have, say, the counselor at the jail talk to you about what their thoughts are in terms of other pieces. You know, you might find 2 or 3 other folks who could come together to be your team.
yeah, I did plan on doing that. And we do
Great.
have to work together on that because,
Sure.
you know, they run the facility. I'm just,
Yep.
you know, a visitor.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I definitely want to ask them what they think. And,
Mhm.
you know, it's not a typical type of, I don't know what you want to call it. You know, usually they just have people from the church go in there.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So,
So in this case, then we could come up with another strategy. We could add that to our mix. We could say, what's our next cycle? And it might help us to get a little further down the road and toward our goal. And then there might be a series of different things. If we continue with that same measure, which is how many people are saying yes to our individual contacts, our individual conversations, based upon how effectively we're engaging them with our group process. Does ACEs get us to here and then something else and then something else, where we keep refining it? So notice what we're doing here in terms of rapid cycle change. Let's do this for a month, see how it goes. Let's do the next thing for a month, see how that goes. We're not saying we're going to do ACEs for the next 2 years and then we'll see how it went. Or no, we're just going to do ACEs. We're not going to measure anything. We just, well, hopefully ACEs is helpful, right? That's how a lot of things get implemented, right? We just do stuff and we say, yeah, and we ask, someone asks us, how's that ACEs thing going? And then we say, I guess it's good. I mean, we don't have a measure attached to it. In this case, we're saying ACEs is supposed to get more folks engaged in individual conversations, because that's how we can really promote their recovery and support them once they're released and that kind of thing. So we're going to measure this. We're going to see if this works. Then we're going to move to the next thing and see if that works. But we're going to do it quickly. So over the course of 4 or 5 months, we might be able to do 2 or 3 different things that are all elements of that kind of moving up the ladder, so to speak, when we're talking about that multiple cycle, working our way one at a time toward this goal. So this was an example of Dwayne's experience, which sort of shows you that PDSA. So let me stop. We have a few minutes left today and see if we have questions related to this kind of core PDSA idea. How does it sound to people?
I like it because yeah, it's, well, I like the aspect of being able to measure your success and like starting, like getting that baseline, like where are you now and where do you want to be? And then I like the idea of doing the cycles, implementing one step at a time. You know, I'm sitting here thinking like, oh, this sounds so simple, but like I clearly have never thought about this before, you know, but I like the idea of being able to measure, you know, I have to think outside the box of like, for me, I'm like, oh, you measure, it's like dollars and cents, or like it's a number, not so much like, you know, and yeah, participants, you know, coming to a meeting, like obviously number of people, but yeah, just being able to measure on like an like, you know, the relationships, you know, less than just pinpointing a number or something like that.
Yeah, no, your point is a great point, Chris, which is sometimes it's hard to put numbers on things that are relationship based, that are interaction based, that are kind of human connection based. So, and next week we'll talk about measurement. That's our focus for our fourth session. And then we talk about these key indicators. So what Dwayne's trying to do is he's trying to help move people toward their own personal recovery goals, right? He's trying to engage them in supports. Well, so like, how do we put a number on that? I put a number on that by coming up with the indicator, which is how many people are willing to have the individual conversations. You might say that's a good indicator. Somebody might say that's really not the best indicator of whether or not they're going to engage in supports or do well with their recovery. Okay, maybe it's not a good indicator. Let's find a different one. But we have to find something that's a measure, because we don't have a way of taking someone's temperature and saying, here's your current recovery motivation, thermometer, right? We don't have one of those. Here's your current kind of likelihood that you'll, connect to services once you're released thermometer. So we have to come up with something that's an indicator. So that's what you're exploring there, Chris, which is really good, right? How do I put a number to this? Now, those would be the objective indicators as a measure, because we want to measure. We might also have some more subjective indicators, like how do people respond to Dwayne's new ACEs tool? He could ask people, we could do surveys, we could get some impressions from the people who are participating, which is a second way of measuring this, right? So we can kind of find a concrete way to measure with a number, and then we can also get impressions. How do people feel about this experience as another way of learning about whether or not it's working for us? So great comment. And I appreciate the way you're kind of struggling with that, how to put a number on this. So next week we'll help you with that.
I have a question. Now, do we make our own Excel spreadsheets for that, or is that stuff supplied? Because I've seen you've got different sections. You've already got one set up. Is that?
Sure.
Do we get that, or?
What we do have that tool, that project change form is in the handouts that we're sharing with you. So you can just print that form out and just write in the boxes and fill out the form as you come up with your change project.
And I would have known that if I would have looked at that.
That's all right. I always say it's cheaper to ask questions than to go look for stuff. Sometimes people have said to me, well, why didn't you just go look for it? I said, well, it's easier to just ask you, right? It's always easier. Just ask people.
Well, that was one of your questions about that, when we first started today was, did everyone have a chance to do that? Nope.
No problem. My assumption is we're all trying to do the best we can to make improvements and to work on these things, and all kinds of stuff will derail us, and we just keep trying to get back to it. So Chris, thanks for sharing the link again that gives you all access to the materials there in that folder.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, and then I'll just leave you with that idea of the aim statement that we talk about. So a nice simple way to think about it is this A, B, C, D, which is we want to increase A from B to C by date D. We want to increase A. In this case, our A was number of people who want to do the individual meetings with us. From B to C, from B, which is the baseline, here's where we are right now, 50%. We want to increase it to, Dwayne said 100%, pretty high standard, Dwayne. So B to C by date D, and that's where we get to the rapid, right? We want to do it within this much time. We're not saying Dwayne's going to run this thing for 1.5 years and see how it goes. Maybe Dwayne does it once a week for 6 weeks. And then he talks with his team and says, plan, do, study. It's been 6 weeks. How are we doing? That's pretty rapid, right? Within 6 or 8 weeks, we can know this seems to work. Based on that, adapt, adopt, abandon, make our choice. So we see how that works. If we kind of use this model, we kind of get acclimated to it. We can pretty swiftly move through things if we're measuring them and see if they're helpful or not for us. All right. Our time is up for today. I want to thank everybody. Check in with Chris, see if you have any final thoughts or ideas related to what we're talking about.
Oh, I would say just have fun with it, all of it. And you don't have to, I say use the tools separately at first if you need to, but just really put them into practice. And even if it's about like, what should the office get for lunch today? You know, like really use these, because then when you have a big project come up, you'll feel very comfortable with all the tools and you can apply them pretty seamlessly.
Yes, excellent. And thank you all for sharing your ideas, for being open to using examples and expressing your thoughts about each of these elements. That really helped us today as we explored this. So thank you all for that. I think it really aided the process quite a bit. So we'll get back together next week for a fourth session. And as I said, we'll focus on data, which is sort of right where we're at right now in terms of, okay, so how do we measure this stuff? Okay.
Yeah, so maybe think about between now and next session, something you'd really like to apply this to, and then Matt and I can help you like formulate question, how are you going to collect that data? Who's going to be on your change team? All those things. So
Yeah.
Think about a situation you want to apply it to.
Good idea. Yeah, come up with some opportunities for yourselves. If you do, then we'll be able to give you some extra support on it.
Perfect.
All right.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks all. See you next time.